All right, well, it sounds like we are on. Hey, grab your Bibles, turn to Revelation chapter 4. I want to start off by kind of just reminding us about our motivation behind this study. I'm going to make no apologies. We're getting into more science today and next week. This is going to feel more like a science class than a typical Sunday school, and that's by design. Right? However, let's not forget the whole motivation behind this. Revelation 4:11, read it with me. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. That's our goal, is just to give credit to whom credit is due. Let's dive in. In the beginning, a biblical and scientific investigation of our past. We are, for any newcomers here, my name is Joel Brown. I'm a member here at the church, but I earned my PhD in molecular biology and genetics, studying tiny stuff that you can't see without a very expensive microscope. I moved here to Arizona to work for the Creation Research Society. It's the largest network of creation scientists in the world, and that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to explore this question. When you look at the world around us, from the biggest nebulae and stars and galaxies all the way down to the tiny stuff, the DNA, the bacteria, the molecular motors, you cannot help but ask this question: where did this all come from? Well, the Bible answers this in the very first verse of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, when it says, in the beginning, God created. And it's really just as simple as that. It doesn't end there. It goes on to give us a little bit of details. And it sums it up nicely in Exodus, where it says, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Pretty straightforward. We've been calling this, in the beginning, God. Now I am going to ask some questions this morning, just to keep you guys, keep this all fresh in your mind. You got to be ready for the final exam, which is, I think 3 weeks from today. So I'm not going to go by section. I'm just going to go by everyone. So when I call it out there, try to fill in these blanks. This is the in the beginning God perspective, also known as the... All right, you guys are on the ball today. The biblical worldview. In the biblical worldview, I see amazing design. I conclude there must be an amazing designer. There are a couple core beliefs that I'm using, and I'm guessing you share them as well. I'm going to ask for the first one. The first core belief. Good. There is a God. Second core belief, the Bible is God's Word. Now, I can't prove these things in a test tube, but when I put these core beliefs in, it affects how I interpret the world around me. That's not the only perspective that's out there. There's the other perspective called in the beginning goo, also known as there it is, the evolutionary worldview. They too are looking at the same world. They see the same amazing design. They conclude it must have come about by time and chance because of their core belief, which is, all right, that nice $10 word, materialism, briefly summed up as no God allowed. So whatever explanation you come up about our past, it cannot involve a God. So when you have these two worldviews, they come to very different stories about our past. In the biblical worldview, a straightforward reading of Scripture, we would say about 6,000 years ago, God created everything. About 4,400 years ago, there was a flood that destroyed everything. About 2,000 years ago, Christ came to this earth, and here we are today waiting for him to come back. In the evolutionary worldview, it looks a bit different. About 14 billion, with a B, billion years ago, there was the Big Bang, the origin of the universe. About 4.6 billion years ago, the earth formed. About 3 billion years ago was the origin of the first life, and mankind arrived on the scene here at the end, about 3 million years ago. Now, things that are different are not the same. And these are different stories of our past, so they can't both be right at the same time. One of them's got to be wrong. I'm not going to try to prove the biblical worldview to you. The biblical worldview is fundamentally faith-based. And don't ever apologize for that. God did prove himself to people in the past very visibly. He walked with people. And he gave us his word and asked us to believe him. Straight up like that. But along the way, you do see incredible evidence that you are no accident. Now, the evolutionary worldview, and this is our main point in looking at all this science, is to point out simply that the evolutionary worldview is also faith-based. And you have seen it. You have seen it firsthand, how much faith is required to believe. So we're looking at the three pillars of the evolutionary worldview: the origin of the universe, cosmic evolution; the origin of life, organic evolution; the origin of you, Darwinian evolution. We've looked at the first two of these pillars. And while you are welcome to believe in cosmic evolution, organic evolution, that non-living soup came to life, don't call it science. Call it faith. And I do not have enough faith to believe in cosmic evolution or organic evolution. And that brings us to our third one today, Darwinian evolution. This is classical evolution. This is what you think of when you think of evolution. In part number 4, chutes or ladders. Now, how many of you have played the game Chutes and Ladders? Good, good. Some of you are deprived and never played it. So I'm going to give you the conclusion of the next 2 weeks, the big picture. What does chutes or ladders have to? I'm going to give you the conclusion, and then you'll kind of see everything working towards that conclusion. So do you remember several weeks ago, we started with this odd question: do you believe in aliens? And some of you got really excited, like we're going to talk about aliens. But no, that wasn't the main point. I was training you that when somebody asks a question like this, you need to say, what do you mean by aliens? Because we're talking about an equally complicated term, evolution. So when somebody says, do you believe in evolution? You need to say, what do you mean by evolution? And now, in today's session, we're going to really get into why this is so critical. Because part of evolution is true. It is. It's scientific. It's observable. But then part of it is just unscientific. And distinguishing between these is key. Here is the key difference. It's all in this game: chutes or ladders. Both the biblical and the evolutionary worldviews believe in change over time. We all believe things change. Here's the key difference. In the biblical worldview, we believe God created everything very good. That's exactly how Genesis says. And it's been changing for the worse ever since. It's been chutes downhill. In the evolutionary worldview, they believe things started out as goo. And it's been changing for the better ever since. It's been ladders. Therein lies the difference. So now we have 2 weeks to kind of unpack this, so let's get started. What would you say are the most influential books in the world? Well, they asked 2,000 British readers what they considered the most influential books in the world, and here's the headline: British readers choose blank and blank as the most influential books. What's behind those blanks? What do you think? Okay, I hear Darwin's book. What else? The Bible. Let's see. These were the 2 books that they chose. 37% said the most influential book in the world was the Bible. 35% said the most influential book in the world was The Origin of Species. That's Darwin's book. Interesting. And by the way, I don't necessarily disagree. They're not saying, if I would say what's the most important book, that's definitely the Bible. But influential books, they're right. Both of these are extremely influential books that have influenced culture at large and how people think. The biblical worldview, our textbook is the Bible. In a very real sense, in the evolutionary worldview, the textbook is this book, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. We're going to look into it. In the biblical worldview, it foundationally is built on you are created in the image of God. In the evolutionary worldview, it's foundationally built upon you are an animal. Those are fundamentally different worldviews that we're talking about, and these are their main texts, the 2 most influential books in the world. So we're going to look into this book. We're going to break it up into two parts. Part 1, what Darwin got right. Part 2, what Darwin got wrong. So let's start with part 1, what Darwin got right. The rest of this presentation is going to be all about everything that he got correct. The end. Thanks for coming. No, I'm joking, right? Because I know we like to kind of joke about that and be like, oh, he was a dummy and blah, blah, blah. No, he wasn't. He had his ideas, many of which are unscientific, but a lot of it's true. Some of it's true. And here's how I like to make this analogy. Suppose you put out some rat poison at home. Is all of that rat poison actually poison? Now let's look at those ingredients. 0.005% of it is poison. 99% of it is good stuff. Because you have to have the good stuff in there to attract the rats. Right? Now, I'm not trying to make too much of this illustration and comparing it to evolution. I'm not saying evolution is rat poison, but there are some poisonous ideas in evolution. And that doesn't mean it's all bad. Why do you think so many people believe in it? It's because there are parts of it that are true. And we're going to split those up today, and you're going to be like, oh, okay, now I see. So let's dive in. Here is what Darwin got right in a nutshell. Things do change over time. He's right about that. So let's see what he's talking about. Did God create chihuahuas? Maybe we should ask a different question. Would God create chihuahuas? Okay. This is actually an incredibly interesting question. Did God create chihuahuas? Well, I hear no's, but doesn't the Bible say all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made? So did God create chihuahuas? Well, see, this is an interesting question. So if you got in a time machine and went back to the Garden of Eden, would you have seen a chihuahua? No. Well, let's check. No, I don't have a time machine, sorry. I'm going to read Genesis, portions of Genesis chapter 1. I want you to look for the word chihuahua. I'm going to read all the white text. I want you to read the yellow text. You ready? Genesis chapter 1. And God said, this is talking about living things that he's creating. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed. And the tree yielding fruit whose seed was in itself. And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly. And every winged fowl. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth. And God made the beast of the earth, and cattle, and everything that creepeth upon the earth. And God saw that it was good. Did you see chihuahuas in there? Obviously not. But what did you see? You saw a lot of this phrase, after his kind. It's almost like God put that in there on purpose. And so we can start to get a glimpse, just a small glimpse of how God created. God didn't create an infinite number of varieties, but he created a discrete number of kinds which could produce a near infinite number of varieties. So no, he didn't create chihuahuas. Chihuahuas were first recognized as a dog breed in 1904. So does that mean they were miraculously, supernaturally created in 1904? Of course not. That means it took them about that long. Somebody was selectively breeding dogs, and someone decided to selectively breed a dog of small stature, larger-than-life personality, and a high-pitched bark, and they got chihuahuas. In other words, things do change over time. Okay, let's take this one step further. Where did all of these dog breeds come from? All 200 of them come from. Well, did you know you could take a wolf, cross it with a dog, a German Shepherd, and you will get a wolf dog. It's kind of a sad-looking wolf dog. Looks like Aaron Rodgers. So they are, although they're different, they are fundamentally the same kind of animal. Did you know you could take, if you had enough time and the resources, you could take a pair of wolves and selectively breed them and produce all the dog breeds that we have today? Dogs have descended from wolves. They are a domesticated version of wolves. Things do change over time. Let's take this one step further. Did you know you can take a gray wolf and you can cross it with a coyote? These are two different wild species. And you will get a coy wolf. So again, although they're different species, they're fundamentally the same kind of animal. But this isn't rocket science. There are some limits to this. I have 4 pictures up here. A dog, a wolf, a coyote, and a banana. Which one is not like the others? Okay, so this is, yes, good. So this isn't rocket science. What we're not saying is that the dog is related to the banana. That's what evolution says, by the way, that the dog is related to the banana. So there are limits here. Now, did you see I've been using these complicated scientific Latin terms with each of the pictures? You see how they all have the first word, canis. They're all part of that same group, canis. And then the second word, the green word, is different. That's their species name. So they're all part of the same group, canis, but they all are different species. Well, let me show you the canis family. These are the 8 different species that are in the canis family throughout the world. You've got dog, you've got timber wolf, gray wolf, etc., Ethiopian wolf. Now, did you know? I'm going to show you arrows, and these arrows represent interbreeding between these different species. So they can all be connected to each other. They can all interbreed through these red arrows. So while there are 8 different species, they are fundamentally the same kind of animal. So all 8 of these species had a common ancestor, and guess what it was? It was a dog. Some sort of dog-like animal that looked like a gray wolf. And from that originally created gray wolf, you have the built-in variability to produce all these species we can see today. We would call this the dog kind. Things do change over time. Let's see some other examples. Here I have Equus ferus, a wild horse, a zebra, Equus burchellii, Equus asinus, the donkey. All the same, part of the same group. Did you know you can take a donkey, cross it with a horse, and you get a? Yeah, there you go.
It depends. It depends if the donkey is the sire or the mare.
That's right. So as it's set up here, the male donkey with the female horse. Did you know you can take a male zebra, cross it with a female donkey, and you get a zonkey. That's the real thing. So although they're different species, they're fundamentally the same kind of animal. We would call this the horse kind. Let's look at another example. Black bears, Ursus americanus. Polar bears, Ursus maritimus. And grizzly bears, Ursus arctos horribilis. It's an appropriate name. Well, I encourage you to try this experiment at home. Take a grizzly bear, cross it with a polar bear, and what will you get? A growler bear. That's a real thing. This happens in captivity, but it also happens in the wild, in Alaska and such, where their range overlaps. You'll get these natural hybrids. So although they're all different species, they are fundamentally the same kind of animal. We would call this the bear kind. You see how this works? Let's look at one more. Panthera burchellii. Panthera tigris, the tiger. Panthera leo, the lion. Well, you can take a leopard, cross it with a lion, and you get a leopard. This is a stuffed leopard. That was a hybrid of these two. You can take a lion, cross it with a tiger, and you get a liger. That's a pretty famous one that you've seen before. So, although these are different species, they are fundamentally the same kind of animal. We could draw it out like this. Oh, but you're never going to get a kangarayan. Fundamentally different kind of animals. Or a xyno. Or a spog, unfortunately. These are fundamentally different kind of animals, not created to interbreed. So here's what we're looking at. You have the cat kind that's God designed with the variability to adapt to all these different environments, produce these different species. You have the bear kind. You have the horse kind. Things do change over time. In fact, if you went to the Garden of Eden, despite what all the children's books tell you, you probably would not have seen a polar bear. Or you may not have seen a tiger in our modern form of a tiger. It wouldn't have looked like that in the Garden of Eden. You would have seen a cat that looked kind of like a tiger, kind of like a lion, kind of like a leopard, somewhere in there. So this is change over time, but it's little change. Adaptation, speciation. So what we want to know is, where did all these different kinds of animals come from that are vastly different from one another? Now, if you are stuck with a worldview that says no God allowed, you have a lot of explaining to do. How did all these different kinds of animals come about? And along then comes this man named Charles Darwin. So let's take a history lesson. How many of you have heard of Charles Darwin? That's nearly everybody. So let's see how much you know about him and his famous book. And we're not going to belittle him. Okay? We're just going to talk about him like an ordinary person. But then we'll look at his ideas in some more detail next week. So he wrote this book, The Origin of Species. Hey, that's what we've been talking about all along. Remember those tiger, leopard, lion, 3 different species. The origin of species. He was interested in this very same question. So I've got a 6-question quiz. And if you think you know the answer, just call it out. Question number 1. What country was Darwin from? Close. England. All right, very good. He was from England. That's, by the way, why the British readers who voted on the most influential books chose Origin of Species in the Bible translated into English in England, and The Origin of Species was written in England, so a little biased. So he was born in 1809 there in Shrewsbury, England. Question number 2, true or false? Darwin was training to be a clergy preacher before going into science. That is true. Yeah, so he was not actually a trained scientist. He began studying in medicine and couldn't stand the sight of blood. Not good to be a doctor if you can't stand the sight of blood. So he switched to study to become an Anglican clergy. I'm not saying that he's the type of clergy that would be allowed to preach here, but he was training to go into the ministry. Back in those days, the professions, medicine was a very noble profession, clergy was a very noble profession, and law was a very noble profession. So that's what the upper crust elites did. They went into one of those 3, and he was very privileged in his upbringing, was able to pursue one of these. So originally he was training to be a preacher. Doesn't mean he believed the Bible, but he then went into science because of this fateful journey. What was the name? So one day he was asked to go on this ship as the naturalist. What was the name of the ship that Darwin sailed on from 1831 to 1836? I'd be impressed. Okay, I heard it from 2 sides there. This is the HMS Beagle. Here's an actual picture of the HMS Beagle. It's sailing around the world. No, sorry, that is fake news. That is not what the Beagle looked like. It looked like any old ship, although it was named after this famous dog breed in England, the Beagle. That was used for hunting a stout warship, mimicking these stout hunting dogs. So he sailed upon the HMS Beagle from 1831 is when he got that position. He was there for about 5 years, sailing around the world. He visited, it went all around the world, and his job was to study the living things that they came across. He says, the voyage of the Beagle has been by far the most important event in my life and has determined my whole career. He then went back to his home in England and spent the next 30 years writing this famous book. In what year did Darwin publish his landmark book on the origin of species? Anybody know? That's close. 57, 69, it is 1859. So 150 years ago, this book was published. And Darwin pretty much stayed in his house for the next 40 years of his life and almost never left his home. He was a very eccentric character that just kind of stayed around. He had 10 kids. So we're going to leave that alone. How many times does the word evolution appear in the origin of species? A big fat 0 times. The word evolution does not appear. However, the last word in the book starts to take us that direction, and I'll show you the very last word in the book when we get there. True or false? Darwin was a self-professed atheist throughout most of his life. Everybody's right. It's true and false. I say because, it's hard to ascertain people's true core beliefs. He certainly did not believe in the Bible as God's word. And he says, in his own words, in my most extreme fluctuations, I have never been an atheist in the sense of denying the existence of a God. I think that generally and more so as I grow older, but not always, that an agnostic would be the most correct description of my state of mind. Basically, I don't know. I don't know if there's a God. That's kind of what agnosticism is, a non-committal, I don't know if there's a God. So that's where we put him. Darwin died in 1882 at 73 years old, but his book lived on and really influenced the world that we live in now. It's heavily influenced by this book. So I want to dig into it just a little, very surface level, and I want you to see some of the things that he saw. And we asked you this question, did God create chihuahuas? And we were like, well, sort of, but sort of not. Well, he asked a similar question, did God create pigeons? That was one of his main fascinations, was studying pigeons. And here are some of the things that he saw. There were pigeon breeders back then that they had these things called fancy pigeons. Very ornate breeds of pigeons. Here are some of his drawings of fancy pigeons. He had them at his house there near London, England. These are some sketches from his Origin of Species book. So he studied all these different varieties of pigeons. Here's what some of them looked like. All sorts of amazing. Here's a giant pigeon next to a small pigeon. The giant pigeon is called runt. Some pigeons with fluffy feathers. Some pigeons that were tall with long legs. Some pigeons with fancy frills of feathers on their necks. So this is kind of like our dog breeds, but in pigeons. And for whatever reason, Victorian era, they loved breeding these pigeons. In Darwin's day, many believed that each breed of fancy pigeon descended from a separate ancestral pigeon species. They would say something like this. One pigeon species produced this pigeon breed, another pigeon species produced this pigeon breed, and then a third one produced this tall guy. Well, Darwin came along and said, wait a second. Great as are the differences between the breeds of the pigeon, I am fully convinced that the common opinion of naturalists is correct, namely that all are descended from the rock pigeon. What's he saying? He's saying they all had a common ancestor, and guess what it was? It was a pigeon. And he spent a lot of his book arguing for this point, that these different breeds descended from a common ancestor, and it was a pigeon. This is little change. This is variation. Here is what he says, just another example, in regards to ducks and rabbits. I do not doubt that they all have descended from the common wild duck and rabbit. No problem. In other words, all ducks had a common ancestor, and it was a duck. All rabbits had a common ancestor, and it was a rabbit, including this rabbit and this rabbit. There's a rabbit in there. Okay, this is little change, right? Big deal. In fact, if you could sum up his book, here's what he says in the introduction, his main point in writing this book. Although much remains obscure and will long remain obscure, I can entertain no doubt, after the most deliberate study and dispassionate judgment of which I am capable, that the view which most naturalists entertain, and which I formerly entertained, namely, that each species has been independently created, is erroneous. Here's what he's saying. God did not create every individual species that is out there. And guess what? That's exactly what we believe in this point. Now you're going to see where it changes. In other words, what he's saying is there's a duck kind, there's a rabbit kind, there's a chicken kind, there's a dog kind. Things do change over time. This guy sounds like he works for his Answers in Genesis. And this is exactly what we believe today. All right, this is little change, big deal. Now comes the big jump in his thinking. Therefore, I should infer from analogy, not from science, from analogy, that probably all the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from some one primordial form. Now that's big change. And now we're talking about a worldview, not science anymore. Here's what he's talking about. The theory of common descent from goo to you. So this is the last sentence in his book. There is grandeur in this view of life, in his opinion, that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. And thus was born the theory of evolution. Now you see why this is like a minefield walking through here. When someone says, do you believe in evolution? What do you mean by evolution? Because there are these two pieces, two sides to evolution. There's this little change and the big change. The little change is variation within a kind. Big change is the theory of common descent from goo to you. Little change is dogs, wolves, coyotes. Big change is bacteria to blue whales. Little change is scientific, it's observable, we see it, we do it all around us in breeding. Big change is unscientific, never been observed. Little change is shoots. There's no new information added. Big change is ladders. There's lots of new information added. The problem is, these are both called evolution in like our everyday culture. And so understanding the difference is key, number one, to dealing with this issue. And here's why it matters. I call this the puzzle mania syndrome. When I was a kid, I was probably like 10 years old. How many of you have ever seen Puzzle Mania magazines? Only like 5 of you? Okay. So they were like these kid magazines that had mazes and puzzles in them. And so I was at my grandma's house one day, and she had a couple Puzzle Mania magazines, and I'm going through them, filling out all the mazes. And there's a little scratch-off bingo game. And if you got 5 in a row, then you would get a free Puzzle Mania magazine. I scratched it off, and guess what? I got 5 in a row. I felt so special that I won. And so my grandma sent it in for me, and to get a free Puzzle Mania magazine. Meanwhile, I had not told my parents about this. We went home from grandma's house, and a month later, I received in the mail a Puzzle Mania magazine and tote bag. I was thrilled. And I went and started solving all my Puzzle Mania puzzles. And then the next month, I got another Puzzle Mania magazine, and it had a bill with it. I was a kid. I was scared to death. I took my Puzzle Mania magazine and I hid it in my closet. I didn't know what to do. And then the next month, I got another Puzzle Mania magazine with a bill. And in tears, I called the 1-800 number on the magazine and asked them to cancel my subscription. I never bought this. And of course they did. And then my mom found out, and she gave them a piece of her mind and rescued me from this stressful situation. I was a kid. I was losing sleep over this whole thing. What happened? Here's what happened. They said, here, we'll give you a free magazine. And I said, I'll buy that. And then they threw in the whole subscription. Okay, here is what's happening in classrooms, college classrooms, high school, elementary classrooms, all over the country. They're going to show you kids, they're going to say, hey, look, see this, these new species have formed. We have a squirrel over here, a squirrel over here. That's evolution. Here, see this, the beaks on the finch. See how they're different? 13 species of finches on the Galapagos Island. That's evolution. And the kids are going to say, I'll buy that. And guess what? They throw in the whole subscription. From goo to you. That's why this is such a big issue. And next week, we're going to look at 2 big problems with big change. Of course, we all believe change over time. We believe that little change happens. But we're going to look at the 2 big scientific problems with big change. And that's in part 2 what Darwin got wrong. 9:56, we got time for a couple of questions. Oh. Start us off, Gabe.
Didn't Charles Darwin, I don't know if it's true or not, in his later years regret publishing The Origin of Species?
So, there is a story, and it was one of my questions, but I took it out for sake of time, so we'll put it back in there. Did he have like a deathbed repentance? And did he deny evolution on his deathbed? So there's an account from somebody who says they were there at his deathbed, and they said that he said